Now available in paperback and e-readers, Spinsterella Goth Girl Summer. Take a trip into the macabre world of goth modeling in the new millennium in this spooktacular Spinsterella story. Pick up your copy of Spinsterella Goth Girl Summer in paperback and e-readers at Amazon.com and online booksellers everywhere. Legendary comic book writer Peter David sadly passed away this weekend at 68 years old. Now, Peter David was an icon of the medium of comic books, but was also known for writing novels, television shows, film, screenplays, and video games. And he's known for his iconic 12-year run on The Incredible Hulk, which basically redefined the character from the late 1980s and 1990s, and is also known for his iconic run at DC Comics on Aquaman, where he turned the character from a character that was known for talking to fish into a very aggressive warrior type character with a hook hand, and is also known for developing the successor to the Teen Titans, Young Justice, and is known for a great run on Supergirl, which featured Linda Danvers, and it's also known for creating the character of Spider-Man 2099, and also for a great run on X-Factor, and a run on Captain Marvel, where he established the legacy of his son, Genis Vell. And that's just his work in comic books. Peter David was also known for writing novels such as the books in the Star Trek series, Young Justice or Ben 10 or Space Cases, and other books that he did, like the adaptations of movies like Batman Forever and the Spider-Man movie books, and was also known for writing different things like screenplays, and had a long and storied career in writing everything from comics to TV shows to screenplays. Now, Peter David's interest in comics started when he was about 5 years old, when he was reading copies of Harvey Comics' Casper and Wendy in a barbershop, and became interested in superheroes when he watched The Adventures of Superman on TV as a kid. Now, his parents didn't mind him reading Harvey Comics or books featuring Disney characters, but they didn't want him to read superhero books, especially those published by Marvel Comics, because they felt that the characters that looked like monsters didn't appear heroic. So they didn't want him reading Marvel Comics because characters like the Thing, who was made of rock, looks like he's made of rocks, or the Hulk, who is green skinned, or Spider-Man, who wore a bug-eyed costume, they thought that those characters didn't appear heroic enough. But Peter David still read those comics in secret, and started with Fantastic Four Annual number 3, where he saw the wedding of Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Woman. And as he was reading those comics in secret, his parents possibly had said this eventually allowed him to read those comics. But his favorite character was DC Comics character Superman, and his favorite artist before the 1970s was John Buscema. And Peter David was a comic fan before it was something considered to be popular. That's why he attended his first comic book convention in the 1970s, when the whole comic book hobby was starting to grow into popularity. Because before then, people just read the comics, and those who had them just had them, and others just threw them in the trash eventually. But people started to get into comics when the whole hobby was starting to burgeon, and he attended his first comic convention around the time that Jack Kirby's New Gods premiered in the 70s, and he asked his father to take him to this Comic-Con, and he also went to one of Phil Seung's shows where he got Jack Kirby's autograph, and that was his first meeting with a comic professional. So Peter David basically was a comic fan before comic fans were being cool, and also had aspirations to be a writer during that time, because him reading comics basically led to him becoming interested in writing. That was something that he learned at the side of his father, because his father was a journalist, and as a journalist, his father, Gunter, basically was a guy, he worked for a newspaper, and they had him writing to review movies, and sometimes when he would go to these movies to watch them, to review them, he would take his son along if it was age appropriate. And that's where Peter learned about writing, from his father, and as his father wrote his reviews at the back of the newspaper office, Peter would write him his own, and sometimes the portions of those reviews would be found on their way into his father's published reviews. So Peter David basically was a published author before he was even before he even was a teenager, because he was working at the side of his father. And as he was working at the side of his father, he had entertained the idea of becoming a professional writer at 12 years old. I mean, this is where Peter's story really reminds me of my own story of growing up at 9 and learning to become a writer. But he had gotten a lot of guidance from his father and learned at the side of his father about writing. And eventually, at 12 years old, went out here and bought a copy of the Guide to the Writer's Market, and then started looking to become a reporter. And Peter David basically, as he was learning how to become a writer at the side of his father, he basically was going out here and learning about the craft of writing. But as he came into adolescence, he basically again lost interest in comics and had thought he had outgrown them. But the whole thing was that as he was out here, he was dealing with things like one of his friends in high school. He found that one of his friends was a member of the alphabet community. He was dealing with homophobia, so he had these types of experiences, and this is stuff that he actually put into some of his stories as his family moved from New Jersey to Pennsylvania. And he had left comics for a while in adolescence, and then eventually started working on different ideas for different books. And that's where he came up with different ideas as related to things. And eventually he came back to comics when he saw a copy of Superman versus Muhammad Ali, and then picked up a comic of the all-new, all-different X-Men, and then eventually started thinking about doing different, reading about different things. I think he met Stephen King, according to some reports, and that helped him towards his aspirations with a writer, having Stephen King basically sign a copy of Danse Macabre and tell him good luck with your writing career. And that basically further inspired him to become a writer. Now, Peter David's influences in writing include Harlan Ellison, Conan Doyle, Robert B. Parker, Neil Gaiman, Robert Crais, and Edgar Rice Burroughs. And he went out here and looked at these writers as the foundation for his style. And eventually, as he finished high school, he eventually went to NYU, graduated with a BA in journalism, and then went on to start going out here and looking to pursue a writing career. And his first assignment was in reporting, where he covered the World Science Fiction Convention in 1974, and eventually wanted to do fiction like many writers like myself want to do. Unfortunately, it's hard to sell fiction. It's very, very hard to sell fiction. It's easier to sell nonfiction. But his first published fiction was in Asimov Science Fiction in 1980, and he sold an op-ed piece to the New York Times, but he ran into the rejection cycle that many early writers run into as they're starting their careers. And eventually he went up and gave up on his career in writing, because writing, you don't really make a lot of money in the beginning, and then just started working in publishing behind the scenes, mainly as an assistant to the editor-in-chief, and then working in the sales and distribution at Playboy paperbacks, and then worked for 5 years, interestingly, at Marvel in the sales department as an assistant direct sales manager under Carol Kalish, who hired him, then succeeded Kalish as a sales manager. So he got a lot of publishing experience in the back, and as he got that experience in the back, he tried to go out here and sell some stories over at Marvel to people like Dennis O'Neil, who was editing the Moon Knight title, and those efforts didn't really go anywhere. But it was 3 years into becoming a direct sales manager with Christopher Priest, who became the editor of the Spider-Man titles, that he basically looked to again cross over, but it was considered a conflict of interest. But the whole thing is that Christopher Priest was considered David a maverick, but as he broke those rules, he eventually wound up coming in, and eventually started coming in as related to stories like the spectacular Spider-Man story, which was the death of Jean DeWolff, which was, again, a very dark story. This was one of his early stories in comics, and it was one of those iconic moments, because the death of Jean DeWolff was a big deal, because Jean DeWolff was a detective who was a major deal in the Marvel Universe, and her death at the hands of the Sin Eater basically was a major event in the mid-'80s. I mean, this was a very big event. And again, this is where Peter David got his break into comics, and again, got his break into comics with things, because this was like the first Peter David story. And as Peter David came in, crossing over from sales to the editorial and creative, basically it became, he came in and became a significant player as related to writing. Now, as he came in, basically, eventually he wound up getting fired from that job of writing after Jim Shooter found out. But eventually, the situation as related to the thing, it did do damage to Christopher Priest's career over at Marvel. However, months later, Bob Harras offered Peter David the role of the Incredible Hulk as writer, and basically gave him free reign on the character, because the Incredible Hulk back in the mid-'80s was a book that was struggling. I mean, it was a book that basically was struggling as related to sales. It had been struggling since the mid-'70s in the whole tragic Lonely Man era of Hulk comics, where Banner was trying to find a cure. He was basically drifting from place to place, and the book basically drifted in direction. And eventually they allowed Peter David to write the Hulk, and as he wrote the Hulk, he began to take the character in another direction as related to things after the John Byrne run, where we got the whole idea of the Hulk being split apart and eventually turning into the Gray Hulk. And then eventually what Peter David did was take us on a journey with the Gray Hulk and the whole issue of the Hulk's multiple personality disorder, and gave us the whole idea of Bruce Banner having this childhood abuse from his father, and this being the root of him becoming this monster that was made by his father, basically going on the roots of the character with Frankenstein, but also going and showing us that there was a psychological motivation for him becoming the Hulk. And eventually all of his stories as related to the Hulk combined with this great Peter David's great writing, starting with we had Todd McFarlane coming on in one of the early part of this run, in some fantastic books like Incredible Hulk 340, which featured an iconic cover of Hulk versus Wolverine, and the whole character of Joe Fixit, which was the Las Vegas leg breaker. All of this is Peter David's creation. I mean, he basically took the character in a book that was poorly selling, one of the books that struggled over at Marvel, and turned it into one of the biggest books at Marvel towards the mid to late 80s. I know because I was at the newsstand, and this was one of those books that basically sold very regularly. And when you went there, it was X-Men, it was Spider-Man, it was Incredible Hulk. And these were three of the biggest titles. X-Men was always a big title, selling in the high six figures. But Spider-Man and the Incredible Hulk, basically, Todd himself had said the book was number 21 and came up to number 1. Incredible Hulk was gaining ground because the writing was really good, and basically everything hit a major peak with the Incredible Hulk on issue, I think, 377 or 371, where Peter David basically took the Hulk as related to these psychological issues and eventually made it where we got the Smart Hulk, who I consider to be one of the coolest characters of the 1990s. I mean, the Smart Hulk was one of the coolest characters in the 1990s, and that was all part of Peter David's incredible run on the Incredible Hulk. Again, one of the most fantastic comics I have ever read. I mean, everything was great on that book as related to presenting Bruce Banner as a psychologically damaged character who was dealing with all of this childhood trauma, and how all this childhood trauma from his abusive father turned him into a monster. All of that basically made the character, brought him back to life and redefined him. And basically, as he was working with several of the greatest artists in that era, working with Todd McFarlane first, then Dale Kwan, who, again, his Hulk is known as I believe to be, the Smart Hulk is the definitive Hulk. And then you had Gary Frank and Jeff Purvis. I mean, all these great artists basically were working on it with him on this run. And they also created other supporting characters like the Pantheon for the Hulk to work with over the course of that story. And that whole series was absolutely fantastic. And Peter David also wrote the first appearance of the Thunderbolts with Kurt Busiek and Mark Bagley on Incredible Hulk 449, which is now considered to be another classic book. And basically, the Hulk had basically was one of the when it was one of the iconic runs from Peter David. Now, as Peter David was writing the Incredible Hulk, he also took the reins of another Marvel comic and basically turned that book around. Now, X Factor, when it first came out, was basically struggling as a book with the original X-Men, and as the book with the original X-Men was struggling, again, he basically revamped the team as a government agency, again with characters like Havoc and Wolfsbane and Forge and Quicksilver, and made that team iconic in the 1990s, and also went out here, and as he was writing X Factor, also wrote other books at the time. I mean, he wrote other books such as had a little run on Wolverine. Also did some new universe books like Mark Hazard, Merc, and also went out here and wrote on books like also worked on Spider-Man 2099. So he was working on a lot of books, but you had to work on a lot of books because the page rates for writers were horrible and still are horrible. And this was what he did in order to make a living, working on all of these different books. And as he worked at Marvel, he also did some work at DC, where he did a 7-issue miniseries called The Atlantis Chronicles, which was about the heritage of Aquaman, and that laid the foundation for the redefinition of Aquaman. He also wrote a miniseries called Aquaman Time and Tide, which was basically did so well, and that it led to the launch of the Aquaman series. The Aquaman series that also is considered iconic as related to Peter David, because Peter David not only went out here and redefined the Incredible Hulk and X Factor, he also redefined Aquaman for an entire generation of comic fans. I mean, when I was a kid in the 70s, Aquaman was known for his gold shirt, black trunks, and his green leggings, and was known for talking to fish. But Peter David gave us a more rugged Aquaman, a more aggressive Aquaman, and some people would call a badass Aquaman, by giving him a hook hand and a more aggressive looking costume with scales on the side and green legs. And that Aquaman basically was known for my generation, Generation X, basically redefined that character. I mean, redefined him as more aggressive, more tough, and basically showed him being somebody who was, again, standing out distinct, because Aquaman basically was in the background of many comics and basically was considered a joke. But this Peter David's Aquaman was a serious take on Aquaman that made you really look at that character and see him as a formidable threat, see him as really dangerous, and basically, again, brought that character back to life like many DC characters were brought back to life. I mean, it was a golden age for me with DC, again, in the 90s, because you had characters like Kyle Rayner redefining Green Lantern, you had Wally West basically taking over and surpassing Barry Allen as the Flash, and Hook Hand Aquaman. I mean, when I think of 90s DC, it was a wonderful time where you got to see many of these characters coming up, and it was basically, we were seeing a new generation of heroes, and that's what Peter David was part of contributing to, as related to things with Aquaman, where he gave us 46 absolutely fantastic issues from 1994 to 1998 before he wound up leaving the book due to creative differences, similar to quitting Spider-Man 2099, another book that he did that was fantastic because they fired Joey Cavalieri as editor, and Joey Cavalieri was a great writer. He wrote the Huntress miniseries that brought us Helena Bertolini. He never gets the respect that he deserves because Joey Cavalieri is a truly talented writer, and Peter David basically quit the book because he stood up for his editor, which is something a good writer usually does. Now, Peter David, as he was working for both Marvel and DC, he basically continued to make great books, and he helped co-write the Marvel vs. DC crossover in '96, and also went on to have one of the great runs on Supergirl with Supergirl in 1996 or 7 or so, and that's where he was on the book with Linda Danvers, and basically again redefined that character as well. I mean, the Linda Danvers Supergirl, which merged with Matrix, that book was very compelling, very well written, very well developed. I mean, it's just every book there was just absolutely compelling. and he gave us a new take on a teenage superheroine that was must-read comics every Wednesday. I mean, whenever Peter David was on a book, it was must-read comics. But another book that he did that I really enjoyed was Young Justice. Now, Teen Titans basically was struggling ever since Marv Wolfman suffered writer's burnout in the early 90s and was struggling as a book. And Teen Titans really was suffering over time as related to sales. The book wasn't doing very well. And that's where Peter David came in and basically just revamped everything after the disastrous Teen Titans book that was done by Dan Jurgens. It's an underrated comic. I mean, I really thought there was a lot of promising ideas, like the characters like Argent and was a really great character. If she had a solo book, she possibly would still be selling now. But many of those books were bogged down because Marv Wolfman really wasn't in a place where he was able to, again, flesh out these ideas. And that's why the Dan Jurgens book, Teen Titans, didn't do very well. However, what happened was that Peter David stepped in and decided to take the characters that were selling well in Robin and Superboy and Impulse and carrying their own books and had them form a team with the new Cassandra Sandsmark younger Wonder Girl called Young Justice. And that book basically was a huge hit because it brought the teen heroes of the 90s DC into a team. And Peter David basically helped bring us back, not by taking Teen Titans to the next level, because what he was doing was saying, okay, the new Teen Titans were Gen X. They had already grown up and become adults. So now what I'm going to do is take this millennial team of Young Justice, make them the successor to the Teen Titans, because the theme of legacy, that was prominent in DC, and Peter David's run on Young Justice really led to the teen heroes coming back and being a viable brand. And Young Justice, again, was the foundation as a show. Later, everything came from Peter David. I mean, Peter David, I think, basically wrote the Bible for Young Justice, the TV series. And basically, as he was writing in comics, he then went from Young Justice over back to Marvel, writing Captain Marvel. Now, Captain Marvel, as a character, he basically took the son of Captain Marvel that had been brought in by, I think, Ron Mars as legacy, and then gave him the title of Captain Marvel and had an epic run on Captain Marvel in 2 volumes of the book in the early 2000s. And basically, again, went out here, and as he was out here with his second wife, he started writing a manga series, English language manga for Negma, for Del Rey manga. And he also started working on creator-owned comics like Fallen Angel, and also wrote a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle series that led to the animated television series broadcast in 2003. I mean, he had been working for many years in comics, and then started working on other different projects like Buffy the Vampire Slayer adaptations, and basically and came back to the Hulk because he basically left the Hulk due to issues with his divorce from his wife, but eventually started going back to working on different books. And again, he had been working for many years on different comics. And as he continued to work on comics, he also worked on other projects. He worked on other projects, like he worked on Star Trek novels, and he worked on novel adaptations of Batman Forever, and novel adaptations of the Raimi Spider-Man movies, and also worked on other novel adaptations of different stories for comic book characters. And that started when he did his first book, Nightlife, which was a contemporary retake of King Arthur in modern-day New York City. That was the first novel that he sold. But he also wrote other books, like Howling Mad, about a wolf that turns into a human after being bitten by a werewolf, and also wrote other books like Photon and Psyman under his house name, David Peters. And he wrote a lot of different novels, like Star Trek novels, and different books like Star Trek The Next Generation. Also wrote adaptations of movies like The Rocketeer and Swamp Thing and Fantastic Four and Iron Man. I mean, he wrote novelizations of all those different movies, and also wrote other different books out here, in addition to going out here and writing different screenplays. and he also was a guy who wrote fan fiction before he became a professional writer. So he's been writing for many years, and he's also known for writing the guidebook for writing comics. I mean, he wrote an entire nonfiction book on how to write comics. I'm going to have to go pick that up, even though I learned different techniques from writing different novels, from learning from novels and screenplays, and I learned reading books like Sid Field's Screenplay and books like Robert McKee's story. I'm going to have to pick up Peter David's book because I wrote comics like John Haynes at Death's Door, and maybe that book could have helped me out a lot. And he also assisted other writers like James Doohan when he was alive on his autobiography. And he also, again, went out here and again wrote different things. He wrote different TV shows like Babylon 5, and he wrote many different shows like Space Cases. And he also wrote and co-produced films like Trancers 4, Trancers 5, and Oblivion 2, Blacklash. And he also wrote things like episodes like Ben 10, Alien Force, and he wrote video games like The Shadow Complex. And he wrote episodes of Young Justice. So he had a very long and storied career. And he also won awards for that long and storied career. He won 1992, he won an Eisner Award for his work on The Incredible Hulk. He won a Wizard Fan Award. He won a UK Comic Art Award. He won the Golden Duck Award for a Young Adult Series. He won Australian OzCon 1995 Favorite International Writer. He won a 1996 Hawkstor Award for Best Script. He won a Julie Award for achievements in multiple genres. He won the 2011 GLAAD Award for Outstanding Comic Book. He won the International Association Media Tie-Ins Grandmaster Award. He won a 2016 Inkpot Award. And he was a consummate professional in the comic book business. He was a consummate professional in the movie and TV business. And he was a constant professional in all sorts of writing. And basically, it really saddens me when I think about the way Peter David was treated. He was treated very poorly by all of these industries as related to his later years. Peter David, as he got older, sadly wound up with serious health issues. And as he was having these health issues, sadly, he wound up becoming a victim of this whole publishing business, a publishing business that basically is work for hire, meaning that if you work on a project, you only get paid your page rate for that project. And sadly, when it comes to freelancers, you don't have any sort of benefits with that whole structure. You don't have anywhere to take care of your health needs, like your health insurance or your retirement at all. And what happened with Peter David is, as he got older and his health started to decline, he basically wound up in deep debt as related to medical bills, and wound up in deep debt as related to all of those medical bills, and wound up in a place where he had to get a GoFundMe just to try to cover some of those medical bills. And that's the sad thing that happened to him, because when it comes down to this comic book industry, sadly, is you can go out here and write books that sell millions of copies, but you don't get any sort of compensation whatsoever. No, you don't really get much compensation whatsoever. And what's even sadder than that is that what happens is that you basically don't have a real way to get paid in your later years like many artists do. Many artists out here who have passed away, like the late George Perez or Neil Adams, they could still go out here and do commissions, or basically, if they wanted to, do some projects on a place like crowdfunding these days in order to cover their bills as related to things. However, when it comes down to writers, many people don't think of writers like myself out here as related to our later years. No, they don't really think about how we're going to be able to make money. And a lot of times when it comes down to many comic companies, they don't like to hire older writers. They don't like to hire older writers like myself, because what they think is that we have a set idea for those characters. However, writers like Peter David have a better sense of those characters, and know those characters, and know how to make those characters sell. But sadly, many of us writers basically can't get much support from the companies that we made millions of dollars for. I mean, Peter David basically, again, made icons out of characters that weren't selling, like the Incredible Hulk, redefined that character for a new generation, redefined Aquaman for a new generation, and much of his Aquaman is the one that you saw in that Aquaman movie. Much of the Supergirl that you see was the Supergirl that you saw in the Supergirl TV series. Peter David basically created all of those ideas, but he didn't have any sort of compensation. No, he didn't really get much compensation as related to things, as related to profit sharing. And what was really sad about Peter David is, again, he was a brilliant creator, but sadly, he didn't understand how to go into the indies. But the indies really were not, they were really growing at the time, and I think he would have basically been able to be one of those writers who could have transitioned over, like Todd and Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld did with Image, and start making your own independent characters. But sadly, Peter David, he basically was out here working in this business, and this is why he had to work on so many projects. And this is where I could relate to Peter David, because I myself had to have to work on multiple projects, because when it comes down to writing and publishing, you can have one book that you can come out here and put all of your heart and passion into, like a Spinsterella Goth Girl Summer. I mean, I put a lot of heart in this book, and the whole thing is it may not sell, and that's why you have to go out here and do other books, like I have to do every year. I have to do a John Haynes book, an Esteem book, an ISIS book, sometimes a nonfiction book, and you have to write a lot of those books, because the only money you're gonna get from those books is the advance usually, and the advances are very low. Usually an advance for a book is maybe maybe $5,000, and they're going to make maybe $200,000, $300,000 on that book, like a Star Trek book, before it goes out of print. But you're only going to get that $5,000, maybe get some royalties here and there before they take it out of print. And it's even worse with comics, that you have comics out here, again, they only going to pay you the page rate, and the page rate for a writer maybe is $50,000 to maybe $110,000 a year. You're basically making about maybe $1,000 a month. That's why he had to work on 3-4 comics, and as he worked on those 3, maybe 4 comics in addition to those novels, what happened with Peter David is that he had expenses, because he had 3 kids. He also had to possibly pay for private schools. He had to pay for health care. He had to pay for the insurance on his home, and after his divorce had to pay out alimony, basically. I mean, Peter David was basically struggling out here as a writer, and I know what he's going through, because I'm going through that myself. I mean, it's a lot of work, again, being a writer, and a lot of writers, again, basically live paycheck to paycheck. And if we don't own anything, own anything, we basically have to sit there and watch as many of our revenue streams dry up. We have to watch as many of the revenue streams we have dry up, and basically wind up becoming drawing down, because as books get discontinued, those books go out of print, so we can't rely on those revenue streams, and we have to keep writing different books. And that's what highlights the death of Peter David, sadly. What highlights it is that we have a very brilliant writer, a man who basically wrote the foundations for a lot of the pop culture we have now, but he never got to enjoy any sort of compensation. He never got to enjoy any sort of compensation as related to his career. And that's what really upsets me about this whole situation regarding Peter David. Again, here's a man who worked for many of these comic companies, worked for many of these different comic companies, and they never wanted to once go back for this man. Again, this man made you millions of dollars, wrote treatments for your TV shows, wrote many of your movies, and this man could barely even pay for his health care, couldn't even get Medicaid, and that was really sad to me. I mean, here's a man whose revenue streams have basically dried up to nothing, and he even couldn't get Medicaid, and that's the sad part about Peter David and his passing. I mean, the way he wound up getting treated by the comic book business was really sad. I mean, it was really sad when I think about how this man was treated. This man basically gave my generation and my cousin's generation, the millennials, and I'm a Gen Xer, he gave us, again, the foundations for many of these characters. As related to us growing up, we basically grew up with many of the characters that he redefined, like the Hulk, Supergirl, Young Justice. These were icons. I mean, they turned Young Justice into an iconic TV show, but they didn't pay this man any sort of compensation for any of his work, and that's the thing that really upset me about him. I mean, this guy basically was, again, dealing with surgeries for back pain, dealing with a stroke that he had, and dealing with all sorts of health issues, and dealing with unpaid taxes and all sorts of issues, and basically just, again, dealing with all sorts of debts as related to his life. And as he was coming in 2022, again, dealing with things like another series of strokes, dealing with kidney failure, and was basically, again, dealing with all of these health issues. I mean, he couldn't even cough or clear his throat and had to be put on a ventilator as related to things. And eventually, sadly, Peter David passed away. And even though he was one of the greatest writers of the 1980s in the genre of comic books, science fiction, and fantasy, people didn't really treat him right in reality. That's what really upsets me about the death of Peter David. This man wasn't treated right as related to the real world, wasn't treated right, again, as related to business, because this man should have been compensated for all the years of work that he did. And that's one of the reasons why I have issues with work for hire, and I basically, again, would look to go out here and, again, publish my own stuff and own my own IPs, would look to own my own stuff, because that's what I would advise any creator to go out here and do. Yeah, you can go out here and work on these comics, but they're work for hire and they're not really going to pay you anything. And that's why I advise people who want to be writers to, again, have your day job, because these comic companies, it's not going to pay you much money. Yeah, they may sell lots of units, but you're not going to make much money. So you've got to have your day job in order to cover your costs. Because, again, even if you go out here and sell lots of books, basically these companies treat people like garbage, and this is why the industry basically is having people not want to come into the business, because they look at the way guys like Peter David are treated, and it's sad as related to things. Here's an award-winning, best-selling author, and basically he proves the point that the late Jack Kirby made, saying comics will break your heart, because it's heartbreaking what happened to Peter David. Again, this man was one of the top writers, and instead of keeping that top writer working, which is what I would do if I had SJS Direct running, I mean, I would want to keep this guy on and keep him out here selling books, because the whole point in the trade world is if you can still write books, nobody wants to, again, get rid of an old author. You need that seasoned author who knows characters and story and can also come into editorial and teach the craft to other writers. I mean, that's what we need as related to this business. And sadly, people didn't see Peter David as the asset that he was. That's what really saddens me about this whole situation. Instead of again looking to have a guy like Peter David around and basically keep him on in some sort of editorial thing, nobody look out for him, because I believe he would basically, if people were to have looked out for this man and looked out for him as is related to his health by providing him quality health care, we would have, again, a great talent basically still with us. But sadly, we lost one of the great talents in comics in Peter David, and sadly, the comic book industry lost one of its greatest writers who basically defined an entire generation of kids as related to comic books and superheroes, and defined it as related to the entire genre of science fiction and fantasy. Now available in paperback and e-readers, John Haynes, A Thorn in My Side. The man who rules the world takes on an agent from the CIA from the Black Boule in this all-new John Haynes series adventure. Get your copy of John Haynes' A Thorn in My Side in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Esteemed Season of the Witch Girl. The aspiring angel takes on a wicked teenage witch in this action-packed, all-new Esteemed series adventure. Pick up your copy of Esteemed Season of the Witch Girl in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers today. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.